In the hush before calamity, when the world seems to hold its breath as if listening for a heartbeat too enormous to belong to any single creature, a ripple of ancient power folded the sky, a tension like drawn wire between two poles of destiny. The sun over a distant mountaintop bled gold into ruins, older than kings. On the far horizon, Eternia's twin moons hung like watchful eyes. Rumors had become rumor no more. Whispers of a convergence tugged at the edges of time, threads that the gods and the sorcerers had tried to keep separate, weaving themselves into a single, inevitable rope. Hercules, scion of Olympus, moved as a man who had learned the price and the currency of strength. He walked with the slow certainty of one who had shouldered the weight of forgetfulness and penance, his scars a geography of deeds, his laughter a weapon that had on occasion split enemy battalions in two. He had known labors that bent reality, tasks set by jealous gods and merciless fate. He had worn his victories like chainmail and carried his defeats like lessons. In him lived the thunder of a pantheon and the stubborn human ache of one who had loved and lost, an ache that made the mortal in him insist that power be tested, that it be proven against the only true measure, another will. Across an ocean of stars, Prince Adam of Eternia transformed when the words of power passed his lips. He-Man, champion of Castle Grayskull, rose like a sentinel of the cosmos, eyes incandescent with the power that answered his call. The sword of power shimmered with a light that had saved worlds and shattered tyrants. It hummed with knowledge and judgment, a blade that was both instrument and oath. He-Man had been forged in a crucible of duty and mercy. He carried with him the conviction that strength was given to guard the weak and to hold the line when darkness came. The power of Grayskull was not merely muscle, it was a covenant with something older than nations, an intelligence that had selected a mortal heart and poured into it the incandescent will to protect. Between Olympus and Eternia, the cosmos whispered questions as the air thickened with portent. Why meet? Why pit one chosen of a world-watching fortress against a son of Zeus? Men in taverns, owls in ruined temples, and stars themselves traced the same answer in different tongues, because echoes demand reply. Because when two centers of authority, one born of divine hierarchy and one born of mystical guardianship, claim stewardships over how power should be used, their principles will inevitably collide. Scholars argued in brittle voices, was Hercules the embodiment of might tempered by penance, a living thesis that strength without restraint is ruin, or was he the paradoxical exemplar that true strength inevitably claims dominion? Priests countered that He-Man's bond with Grayskull represented the ideal that power, when offered to a compassionate steward, becomes a shield rather than a scepter. The argument hardened into a blade. Prophets on both sides offered omens, an earthquake at Olympus's foothills, a blue comet streaking over Eternia, both signs read differently depending on the reader's bias. Hercules observed the rituals of the mortals who still knelt to him and felt the thrill of being needed, but also the old bitter knowledge of how gods could be instruments of their own vanity. He had seen heroes fall because they refused to accept the limits of their fury. He had also seen empires crumble when mercy was never tempered by force. He-Man, trained to be both defender and moral anchor, remembered the faces of the many he had saved and those he could not. His power had not lifted him above compassion, but had amplified it until mercy itself became thunder. The stage was set not by hatred but by an argument the universe could not adjudicate by consensus, which principle holds when all the stakes are cosmic, unyielding, primordial strength that enforces order through the authority of gods, or sanctified stewardship that grants power only to those chosen for restraint, or could both be true in different measures. Voices from the fringes, a dying oracle in the ruins of Delphi, a reclusive mystic who had once read the bones of Eternia, spoke a last discordant truth. They said the confrontation must be more than spectacle, it would be a crucible, a philosophy given flesh. Each champion would face not only bone and sinew, but the consequences of what it means to hold power. Secrets and rumors fed into the wider world, a storm tiger summoned by jealous sorcery on the shores of the Aegean, faint calls from Grayskull like the groan of an unlatched door. Men sharpened blades and priests burned incense. Children carved miniature heroes from clay and prayed for the victor who would safeguard their tomorrows. In the private hours before dawn, Hercules stood on a cliff looking east, feeling the old hunger of a warrior who knows that some questions must be answered on the field. He recalled the labors that shaped him, the lion of Nemea, the hydra's many-headed cunning, the tasks that had demanded ingenuity as much as strength. He remembered moments when violence had not been the answer, and times it had been the only language left. Somewhere beyond the horizon, Prince Adam regarded his reflection in a dark pool. Then transforming, He-Man flexed his fingers around the familiar leather hilt of a sword that was both burden and salvation. The power of Grayskull sang in his bones like a promise. Neither man misunderstood the gravity. Each carried promises to gods, to guardians, to themselves that could not be forsaken. There was no malice in the meeting. There was inevitability, a collision born of truth seeking to be tested. The world leaned in. The first thunderheads gathered. The first stars flinched. When the hour came, it promised to answer a question that had echoed since the first clay idol was smashed on a hilltop. When two ideals of power clash, which one reshapes the world? The valley chosen for the duel was a place between worlds, a basin where an old river had carved runes into the bedrock and where the grass still remembered footsteps of gods. When Hercules descended, the earth acknowledged him with a tremor. When He-Man walked forward, the air around his sword shimmered and the stones sang an ancient ward song. They regarded each other not as enemies but as inevitabilities. Hercules' face was a map of battles, smile quick and slightly cruel, eyes that had outlasted empires. He-Man's bearing was unyielding grace, a calm that was the product of a lifetime of choosing when to strike and when to spare. Their first exchange was not of blades but of questions, a bellow from Hercules asking whether power should be tempered by duty or by dominion, an answering roar from He-Man that power belongs to those who would defend. Then the world broke into motion. Hercules lunged with the speed of a god who has swung thunder across the sky. His mace, forged in Hephaestus's furnaces, was a comet of iron and intent. He-Man met him with the sword of power, its edge singing with counter-energies, a waveform of ancient Grayskull magic that could cut through spells and illusions. The clash rang like the collision of tectonic plates. Lightning braided the sound. Hercules fought with the ferocity of one who had wrestled beasts and heavens. His blows were experiments in geometry and force, arcs designed to test the very limits of He-Man's endurance. He-Man countered not merely with parry and riposte, but with cunning. He channeled the sword's magic to alter the cadence of the clash, to turn Hercules' momentum into opportunities, to create slivers of advantage where none seemed possible. For a time the fight stood as a perfect, terrifying parity. Strength against responsibility, will against stewardship. He-Man's magic allowed him to produce feats that forced Hercules to retreat, to summon gusts and spectral shields, to pivot the battlefield with a sweep that bent reality enough to crack the canyon walls and send pebbles into the sky. Yet Hercules adapted with God-forged resilience. He bore the assaults and returned with blows that tested the sword itself. Their battle became a dialectic in muscle and metal. He-Man's strikes carried a moral clarity, every move measured to incapacitate rather than annihilate, every finishing blow avoided because it would remove a defender the world still needed. Hercules' strikes, however, were a different calculus. He struck to end, believing that some evils and some cycles required finality. On the third turn of their contest, as dusk painted the cloud edges silver, He-Man summoned a tempest from the sword, glassed lightning into a lattice and pushed Hercules back, the ground crying out from each impact. He-Man's voice, carrying the authority of Grayskull, summoned visions of the lives he had guarded. These specters scoured Hercules' resolve, reminding him of the duty that comes with power. Hercules laughed, a sound without cruelty this time, and pressed forward. He shifted tactics from brute force to theater, employing the guile of a warrior scholar. He baited He-Man into defending innocence, phantoms conjured by Grayskull's test, and when He-Man hesitated, Hercules struck with the cruelty of necessity, a blow intended to expose, not to kill. That strike cracked He-Man's guard, and for the first time blood warmed the champion's lips. He-Man staggered but did not fall. The struggle reached myths within myths. The sword of power, sensing its bearer's weakening, glowed like a dying star and unleashed a cascade of magic that threatened to sunder earth from sky. He-Man poured soul into blade and raised a shield of righteousness that shimmered with every life he had ever protected. The magic sought to break Hercules' resolve by showing him the price of finality, visions of worlds where his victories had curdled into empires, where order became oppression. Hercules staggered beneath the weight of those possibilities, and in that thin breath, his own humanity flashed, the knowledge that unchecked might could become an instrument of desolation. Yet the temples that taught him to bear such terrible knowledge had taught him another lesson, that restraint is noble, but sometimes restraint becomes abdication. He remembered the Hydra's endless heads and the times when leniency had fed monsters that later feasted on innocence. With a roar that cleaved silence, he embraced the terrible calculus of a god hero, steeping his will in a finality that was not cruelty but a chosen responsibility to end cycles. He hurled his mace with a force that warped the air, a strike aimed not merely at He-Man's flesh but at the sword's connection to its source. The mace struck true, the sound of it like the closing of a vast iron gate. The sword's light flared and then faltered. Grayskull's voice, lonely, ancient, whispered a displeasure like wind through dead leaves. He-Man, bearing the blow because he would not abandon his post, stumbled to one knee. He raised the sword again, but its glow was uneven, the links to its power frayed. In that narrowing instant, Hercules did not raise his weapon to slaughter. He stood over the fallen champion and offered instead a choice, an echo of the labors that once taught him mercy: yield to a world that needed guardians, or end this to prevent greater harm. The valley held its breath, and the stars leaned in to hear the answer. He-Man, bloodied and bound by oath, looked up with a clarity that made Hercules feel the rightness of the universe tighten around him. He saw the cost of eternal vigilance and the fleetingness of mortal mercy. He clasped the stone rim of the valley, and with a warrior's dignity, relinquished his sword's pretense of invulnerability. He yielded not out of defeat alone, but from recognition that some wounds are lessons and some victories are judgments. Hercules lowered his mace. In the hush, he chose not to strike a killing blow. He chose instead to bind and to carry the fallen champion to a place of healing and judgment. The philosophic victory was neither simple nor triumphant in song. It was a hard, molten thing forged in the collision of ideals. Hercules' win was justified not because he overpowered He-Man in raw force alone, but because he enacted a difficult synthesis. He demonstrated that divine force, when tempered by the wisdom to end cycles of harm, could be the decisive instrument that safeguards the many. He proved that finality, wielded with conscience and followed by mercy, could prevent the slow dissolution of worlds under eternal, ineffective guardianship. He-Man's surrender was not a negation of his principles, but an affirmation that the world's protection required different hands at different times. As dawn broke, Hercules carried He-Man in a bearer's arms toward a place where Grayskull's wisdom and Olympus's judgment could meet. The victor had been decided in the Valley of Decisions, but victory's scent was mingled with grief and relief. The world would remember not only who fell and who stood, but the lesson they had taught one another, that power without end refuses the possibility of good, and mercy without the will to end cycles invites ruin. Hercules had won, not as a conqueror basking in dominance, but as a penitent titan who had accepted the lonely work of deciding when to close a door so that countless others might keep theirs open.